Some of you know this already. These are called pawns. In this video, I'm going to show you the 5 crucial things to know about pawns. These are the rules you must follow. After that, I'm going to show you the 12 strategies to use with the pawns to deploy during your chess game. All right, come on, join me. Let's get into it. Get your coffee. Here we go. Okay, number 1. The pawns move 1 square forward, which takes us to number 2. On the pawn's very first move only, it can move 2 squares. So black, if it's black's turn to move, they could go from D7 to D5. After that, on black's next turn, which is going to be after white gets a turn, then black can move to D4 if they choose, or they can move a different piece. Depends on what they want to do. Number three is that pawns capture diagonally only. If white moves 2 squares, black moves 2 squares. Right now, these pawns are facing each other diagonally. That is the only way to capture, is diagonal. And to do so, since it's white's turn to move, they get the first choice to capture in this scenario. What you're doing in a real board, over-the-board game, is you're removing your opponent's piece from that square and putting your piece on that square. That's how you capture a piece, as opposed to like jumping over it or putting them on the same square or something, games may have, and land on that square. Playing on the computer just removes it for you once you drag and drop the piece onto that square. The 4th rule to know about pawns is that you can do something called en passant. Let me set up the scenario. If it was white's turn, and then black's turn, and then white's turn, if black now decides they want to move the E pawn, which is this one, 2 squares forward, which happens to land right directly next to the opponent's pawn. This is the only scenario in which you can pass a pawn that just moved next to you and capture the pawn, and that would remove it from the board. Okay, so that's called en passant. Let me do it again just to make sure I explain that thoroughly. If black moves 2 squares, lands next to a pawn, white has the option only right now, not later. On its next turn, it has to do it. It can move as if it were capturing it diagonal from the first square. I'll do it on a completely different pawn. If white moves 2 squares forward, lands next to a black pawn, black has one option on its next turn to move in front of that pawn and remove that pawn. That is called en passant. All right, the next thing to know about pawns is that they can be promoted. If you get the pawn across the board from the 2nd rank all the way to the 8th rank, if you're white, or if you're black, you get it from the 7th rank all the way to the 1st rank. You have the option to promote it to, you can promote it to a bishop, knight, rook, or queen. So if black landed here on B1, it would become a queen in most cases. All right, strategy number 1. Control the center with pawns. If white's move is E4, which is very common, look at the control it has on D5 and F5, because they attack diagonal. If black were to land a knight here on F5, the knight would be captured by the pawn if white chooses to take that advantage. So control the center with pawns. Now black may respond and control these 2 squares. So now you have a battle. The E4, E5 opening is very, very famous. Put some knights on the board just so it doesn't look like all pawns. White might decide to prepare to move another pawn, move the D pawn in the center after this. Well, what would that look like? If black captures and then white captures, now white has now white has a good grasp of the center of the board with its 2 pawns, all 4 of these squares. Now, black might have a couple of knights out here, but those knights could possibly get chased around and allow white to take over the board. Strategy number 1, take control of the center and use pawns to assist in doing so. This next strategy is called pawn chains. In other words, they're sort of connected to one another diagonally. So if one pawn gets in trouble, the pawn that is protecting it or diagonal to it can assist. This allows multiple strategies where the pawns work together to work their way up the board and maybe allow your knights and bishops and rooks additional places to land throughout the game. Strategy with pawns is understanding pawn breaks, how to break the structure of your opponent's pawns just by moving your own pawn. In this example, if white wanted to break black's pawn structure, it could simply push pawn e5 forward. Now, if black doesn't take, white would be able to promote to queen. So black basically should take, which would now damage black's structure. This would be a pawn break because you broke black's pawn structure, forcing them to capture your pawn or suffer consequences of promotion, for example. The next pawn strategy is called Pawn Storm, where you launch a group of pawns hoping to accomplish many things, attacking pieces, cornering pieces, forcing your opponent to play defense too much. There's an actual Grandmaster type of opening called Alekhine, in which black gets chased around the board in the very beginning while you launch several pawns. So this is like a 4 pawns opening by white. This would be considered a storm of pawns in which you're aggressively pushing multiple pawns. It's important to remember that pushing multiple pawns can be powerful, but can also be damaging because now white has very little protection to defend some of its king's position and many other cases. So it's not always a good thing to push your pawns, but it is often a good thing. It gives you more space, gives your queen more movement, your rooks more space, and that space is where you can create tactics, landing a bishop and a knight in a way that they can attack a piece together and have more options with more space. Okay, pawn promotion made it into both categories. How to move the pawns, but also strategize. So it does count as a strategy. Get that pawn promoted. Use the possibility of promoting a pawn to your advantage also. Sometimes them knowing you can get a queen out of a pawn will lead to sacrifices they don't want to make. But no matter what, it's important to understand that that pawn is valuable and could be a queen, and you could have multiple queens. You could have 2 queens against 3 queens. It's not so common, but depending on your skill level, as you get to better and better, you will learn just how important it is to promote these pawns. This next strategy is about pawn structure. The way in which your pawns are located with relation to one another. In this example, white's pawn structure is very well intact. All these pawns can be defended by another pawn. They can move freely throughout the game, and so forth. Black, however, has pawns like double pawns, where it's one on top of the other, so the pawns can't really defend each other. They can't move, and it just ends up being a problem. These 2 double pawns are very detrimental to the game, as white might want to attack these weak pawns with, say, a bishop and queen or a knight and a queen, So keep the structure intact by not allowing trades that this pawn structure could be damaged. For example, in this example, white's pawn structure could be damaged if white were to move the queen onto a dark square, as black could capture the horse, and now the pawn structure is damaged. What white might want to do instead is simply bring the bishop to e2. Now, if black captures, white can use the bishop and defend, keeping the pawn structure intact. The next point on pawn structure is simply isolated pawns. That is, in this situation, black has 2 isolated pawns, which is not great. These 2 pawns are, although they're not double stacked like a double pawn, they're not really able to defend each other because they're separated by a gap. In this case, it would be much easier for white to run these pawns down together as a team, and as the king attacks one pawn, the other one advances, and before you know it, you might lose one, but you end up with a queen. Well, black would have a little harder time because, and whether or not there's multiple pieces on the board, it's the same idea, but it's just better to try to keep those pawns connected together. You will have opportunities throughout the game to capture with a pawn or capture with a different piece, and you want to look at the structure of your pawns to make those decisions. This next strategy is called passed pawn. White has the option to capture on the F file, the D file. In both cases could be captured. But it could also pass those pawns instead, which would give white a strong advantage and would be able to promote to queen, actually. So you have to watch out as black in allowing your opponent to create a passed pawn. Next strategy with pawns is called pawn defense, keeping the pawn close to your king, not moving it too far from your king to create a weakness in your game. In this scenario, white has all three of its king's pawns still intact right where they started on the starting square. Black, however, has created a massive weakness. If it were white's turn, it could capture black's pawn and put the king in danger. This one also made it onto both lists, the top 5 rules and the top 12 strategies. En passant, as a strategy, keep in mind, in this scenario, white has the option to capture diagonally. And this can be used to exploit your opponent's double move with the pawn. All right, the next strategy is pawn sacrifice. While my example is a little bit on the extreme side, this happens in smaller ways throughout the entire game where the opportunities will arise where you can choose, instead of to protect your pawn or capture with your pawn, you can simply give your pawn away. In this situation, if it were white's turn to move, white could say, you know what? I don't care if black takes my pawn. I want to get my queen over here with this pawn. So white could choose to sacrifice the F pawn for a greater value. So if black takes, white promotes to queen and checkmate. The game is now done. The king has nowhere to go. Throughout your pawn learning, there will be opportunities to create pawn islands or to not create them. A pawn island is, well, you're not exactly isolating a pawn to be alone, but you're isolating a couple of pawns to be separated from a large group of pawns. In this case, it can be disadvantageous as well. Keep in mind pawn islands. That way, when you have opportunities to keep those pawns connected, really assess how much are you willing to pay to make sure those pawns stay connected. This strategy is known with other pieces as well. It's called the fork. Keep in mind that the pawn could move forward to attack 2 pieces at the same time, so long as it's protected. In this example, the bishop and the knight are both under attack by one pawn, which is called a fork. If the bishop takes the pawn, the bishop will be captured. Now you have traded a 3-point piece for a 1-point pawn. This next one is called a backwards pawn. Understanding a weak pawn, it cannot be protected by another pawn. If it moves forward, hoping to be defended later, it would simply be captured. So understand a backwards pawn should not be created when you can avoid it. It would be much smoother to advance the D pawn first. Now, if it's captured, you can advance the other pawn, rather than simply advancing and being captured, like in this example here. White advances, black captures, black has a passed pawn, much closer to promotion than white, which would have to travel a lot further to promotion. Our last strategy for pawns is going to be endgame pawn structures. The last strategy is endgame pawns. While this cannot be thoroughly covered in one quick lesson, it's going to be important for you to keep in mind and understand over time that your endgame pawn structure, your endgame quantity of pawns versus your opponent is so crucial. It all can come down to having one more pawn than your opponent, and that is the very pawn that made all the difference. This happens thousands and thousands of times a day in chess games. So protect your pawns. Sometimes you need to sacrifice them, make sure it's worth it. But other than that, you want to defend your pawns and use them like they're very high value, as they would hopefully become a queen someday. Well, that is it for the 12 pawn strategies. Just remember, pawn strategies vary depending on the position and your overall game. Flexibility and adaptability are key in using pawns effectively. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.